Hi everyone and welcome, this is the Apostate Prophet. The Islamic religion claims in the Quran that it is the perfect and complete guide for all humankind until eternity. Nothing is supposed to change at all, which means it is seen as the perfect system before humankind, during the lifespan of humans, and also in the afterlife. Considering that the Quran contains things that were quite normal back in Arabia in the 7th century, but are seen as unacceptable in today's world, that causes a real problem. A threat. One example of those outdated things is slavery. The Islamic religion allows and regulates slavery, while the Prophet Muhammad practiced slavery in many of its forms. Although Muslim apologists whitewash, downplay, or directly deny, if we go around them and look directly at Islamic scripture, the sources of Islam prove our point entirely. Since the Quran is the main source of Islam, let's take that first. The first verse that gives it all away is chapter 2, verse 178. O you who have believed, prescribed for you is legal retribution for those murdered, the free for the free, the slave for the slave, and the female for the female. In this Quran verse, Allah clearly divides humans into three categories: men, women, and slaves. The three are not equal, they are each a class. I know, Allah is just and sweet. Moving on, in chapter 16 verse 75, Allah makes a comparison between a slave who is owned and unable to do a thing, and a free man whom Allah gave the means to maintain his life. He points out that these two are obviously not equal. As you can see, Allah is very just, which can also be seen in the next verse, where he compares a dumb person to a functional person. Isn't the Quran just beautiful? Few verses later, Allah even says that He is the one who holds up birds and makes them fly. And I always wondered how birds fly. Thanks Allah. Screw you, science. In chapter 24, verse 32, the author of the Quran treats slavery like an everyday issue and tells Muslims to make their male and female slaves get married. And in multiple other verses, the Quran explicitly refers to and allows sexual interactions with slaves, and also directly mentions the enslavement of war captives as the main source of slavery. If we move from the Quran to the Hadith, those say even more. Slaves were used for pretty much everything. In authentic reports, we can very much see that Muhammad was just fine with other people's slaves quickly making a chair for him so that he could rest his bottom on, that I don't want to further describe. Or that slaves help him medically, or prepare his food, or have sex with him, whatever. He also had an issue with the skin color of slaves, apparently. In an incident, a slave came to Muhammad to embrace Islam, and Muhammad didn't know that he was a slave. When the master of that slave came and wanted him back, Muhammad offered to keep the Arab slave and give the master 2 black slaves in return. A quite telling narration about Muhammad, who can just take 2 disbelieving black slaves out of his pocket just to get 1 more worthy Muslim man in return. To be fair, Muhammad discouraged practices like beating the slave too harshly and leaving marks. But disciplining slaves when they do something wrong was allowed nevertheless. Muhammad once said that you shouldn't beat your wives the way you beat your slaves and then go and have sex with them. Muhammad knew very well that women are a bit more worth than slaves. Slaves can be beaten in a way, wives can be beaten in a less harmful way, and men can't be beaten. Allah loves men too much. But then there is also the issue of freeing slaves, which should be a positive thing for Islam. To make it quite short, Muhammad encouraged the freeing of slaves in return for the forgiveness of sins. So Muhammad basically offered a solution to people who can buy slaves and then free them. Apart from that, freeing a slave was seen as a good deed, as mentioned in the Quran and the Hadith, but it was never an obligation. And Muhammad also discriminated here and explicitly said that freeing Muslim slaves was a key to heaven. He also offered a way for slaves to free themselves from slavery. Slaves could make a contract with their owner, and if the owner trusts the slave, the master could release the slave so that the slave could work and pay off his own price. Of course, if the slave fails to do so, he or she falls back into slavery. Now, due to this concept of freeing slaves, Muslim apologists claim that Islam was a merciful religion and the first religion in the world that treated slaves with dignity. What they don't do, of course, is tell you the whole truth. In surrounding contemporary cultures like Romans and the Persians, freeing slaves was a good deed as well, and being unfair to them was forbidden. Masters had obligations regarding their slaves, and slaves could make claims before court. Freeing slaves was very often encouraged in the Persian Sassanid Empire. Let's talk about contemporary cultures. The Roman Empire even enacted a law in 4 AD, 6 centuries before Islam, to make regulations on freeing slaves because the manumission, the freeing of slaves, was going so rapidly it was getting out of control and becoming a problem in organizing the community. This happened more than 600 years before Muhammad started his prophet game, and is well recorded in history. So if Muslim apologists tell you that Islam was so beautiful that it introduced the freeing of slaves, you can call bullshit on that. Muhammad was not so fond of freeing slaves at all, by the way. Here are 3 reports that Muslim apologists won't tell you about, and you will see why. In one hadith, a Muslim man promises to free his slave when he dies. Muhammad learns of this and disagrees. He sells that slave back into slavery instead and sends the money to that Muslim who wanted to free the slave. In another hadith, a Muslim man again intends to free 6 slaves that he owns. Muhammad took those 6 slaves instead, separated them into 3 groups, then by chance freed one of those groups and put the other 4 slaves back into slavery, although the owner wanted to set them free. And finally, Muhammad's wife freed a slave girl that belonged to her and told Muhammad about it. Muhammad said to his wife, "You would have gotten more reward if you had given her to one of your maternal uncles." So Muhammad's wife frees a slave that belongs to her, and Muhammad doesn't applaud her. Muhammad says you should have given the slave to someone else instead. Now Muhammad doesn't look like a revolutionary slave-freeing guy at all, right? And finally, very hard to predict, Muhammad had numerous slaves and was very active in buying and selling slaves. Early Islamic reports even name his slaves and count over 40 of them. Muhammad was not only big in warfare and having a huge personal harem that included a little girl, he was also a big master of slavery. Now, after all of this, I could go on like Muslim apologists usually do and tell you about all the beautiful things on how Islam treated slavery. When a Muslim comes to me and tells me that Islam was so good to slaves, unlike many other cultures, what exactly is the point of that? What's the purpose? Isn't Islam supposed to be a perfect and complete system for all humankind until eternity? How can a religion approve of stripping people of their liberties, turning them into property, and then still claim to be the perfect system in 2018? Yes, other cultures had slaves. Yes, there were big slave trades and slave markets across the world. That's because as humans we are going forward into the future. There are so many things that were considered totally normal 1,000 years ago and are unthinkable today. But the difference between the Atlantic slave trade and Islam is that the Atlantic slave trade was a flawed and outdated human product that people regret and condemn nowadays, while Islam was supposed to be perfect back then, perfect now, and still the perfect system to live by in 500 years, according to its own scriptures and believers. How will people in 2400 view the Quran and Islam if they read the scripture and learn about how Islam approves of slavery? As we have seen, Islam directly condones and even encourages the taking of slaves from captives of war. You can probably tell where this goes. Today, self-proclaimed caliphates like ISIS that ignore international laws and agreements go back to Islamic law and enslave people. They don't do this because they corrupt Islam, or because they are just a bunch of lawless people. No, they take this practice directly from Islam, which undeniably gives them the right to commit such atrocities. Nowhere in Islamic scripture does it discourage or condemn slavery, and nowhere does it imply or explicitly tell about any end of it. Slavery is mostly gone not because of Islam, but because of international laws, because of the abolition of slavery that was initiated by dirty disbelievers. Thank you. Next week I will go on from here and talk about how the Islamic world kept slavery very much alive, combined it with racism and religious discrimination, and how the Arab slave trade was alive for a very long time. I'll basically talk about how Islam enslaved the world before it was cool. Hope to see you there. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please don't forget to like, to subscribe and to share. Videos on this channel aren't monetized, so you can watch everything without ads. If you want to support my cause, you can support me through Patreon monthly or through PayPal once. Thanks for every kind of support, which will definitely help spread our message. Thank you so much. Don't be a slave. Don't approve of slavery. Stay away from Islam.